What if I told you that a boy stood between life and death, crossed the border of the unknown and came back with a surprising revelation, something that defies logic, intrigues scientists and moves millions of people around the world? He not only had a near-death experience, NDE, but it brought a direct message from Jesus, a powerful warning that could change everything we know about the world, beyond spirituality and the purpose of life. This story begins unexpectedly. An accident. One moment. The silence of death. Doctors were hopeless. The boy's heart stopped. His body was there, but his consciousness, well, that was taken to a place that few have ever seen and managed to return to tell about. What did he see on the other side? Who did he find? What was the mission you were given before returning? Get ready, because this story is unlike any other. NDE reports have been documented in thousands of cases, but this one has something special. A revelation that will move you regardless of what you believe. Is it possible that science cannot explain what happens after death? Are the reports of people who saw heaven and met Jesus real or mere hallucinations? The boy who came back from a coma has an answer, and it may surprise you. Matthew was only 7 years old, but he was a bright boy. Curious, full of life, and always with an innocent smile on his face, as if he carried a special glow within him. He lived with his parents in a small town in the interior of the United States, where his routine was simple and happy. He loved playing in the yard, chasing the family dog and listening to the stories his mother told him before bed, but no one could have predicted that, in a single instant, their story would change forever. That afternoon, Matthew was excited. The family was getting ready for a car ride, a short trip to Grandma's house. Everything seemed normal, until along the way the unexpected happened. A vehicle ran a red light at high speed and collided violently with the family's car. The impact was brutal. Shattered glass flew through the air, metal twisted like paper, and, in a matter of seconds, a heavy silence took over the scene. Inside the car, Matthew's father tried to move, feeling the throbbing pain in his arm. The mother, with cuts on her face, was desperately looking for her son, and then she saw him, tiny, motionless in the back seat. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Despair took over. Paramedics arrived quickly, but the scene was not encouraging. The boy's body was inert. The heartbeat was weak, almost imperceptible. The diagnosis was devastating: severe head trauma. He was rushed to hospital where doctors raced against time to try to save him. The news fell like a weight on the family's shoulders. The injury is severe, the experts said. The chances of recovery are slim. The mother's heart broke. The father, trying to be strong, held back tears as he looked at his son's small body, lying in that cold hospital bed. Time seemed to be running against them. Then, Matthew fell into a coma. The following days were harrowing. Medical equipment controlled every beat of his heart. The monitors flickered, the machines breathed for him. The doctors tried, but the prognosis was bleak. If he wakes up, they said, he could have serious consequences. But to be honest, he might not wake up. But what no one knew was that at that exact moment Matthew was somewhere else. His eyes were closed to the physical world, but his consciousness had crossed an invisible boundary. He was beyond death. At first he felt no fear. There was peace, a peace so deep, so intense that it was like nothing I had ever felt before. He saw no walls, no ceiling, nor the doctors around him. Everything was light, a warm, welcoming, living light. Then he realized that I wasn't alone. In the distance, a figure began to form, a powerful presence, but at the same time loving. The energy emanating from her was indescribable. When Matthew tried to focus his vision, he knew immediately who was there. It was Jesus. The description that Matthew would give later upon waking up would leave everyone perplexed. He said Jesus was beautiful, more beautiful than any picture or painting he had ever seen. His eyes had a shine that was impossible to describe, as if they contained the very essence of love. He wore a white cloak, and around him there was a golden, pulsating, almost living light. He held my hand, Matthew said, and he told me I needed to go back. The emotion in the boy's voice was so pure that doctors, parents, and even nurses who heard him got goosebumps. I didn't want to go back, he continued, because it was wonderful there. But Jesus said I still had something important to do, and then came the most stunning revelation. People have forgotten who he really is. The room was completely silent. What was Matthew saying? He was just a child. How could I know something like that? How could I describe such a detailed, intense encounter with Jesus? The doctors, who always seek rational explanations for everything, exchanged confused looks. Matthew's brain should have been inactive, with no record of consciousness. But then how could he report something like that so clearly? The mother, with tears streaming down her face, held her son's small hands. "What else did he say, my love?" he asked, his voice trembling. Matthew looked at her calmly. "He said he's coming back, and we should be ready." Those words were like a shock. Could this be a real message? A divine warning? What if this 7-year-old boy had actually crossed over to the other side and come back with the truth the world needs to hear? Matthew's story was just beginning. The truth about life after death cannot be ignored. NDEs show that the journey continues beyond this world. Leave your like and subscribe now for more real stories that reveal what happens on the other side. Matthew couldn't say when it all started, but what he felt first was an indescribable lightness. It was as if all the weight in his body, all the pain and all the fear had simply disappeared. He found himself floating, effortlessly, without needing to move arms or legs, as if he was suspended in the air, being gently carried by an invisible force. There was no longer the noise of the monitors. There was no longer the pain of the impact of the accident. There was no longer fear, just a deep peace, as if he was being enveloped by something bigger than himself. He tried to look down and saw something that confused him. Your own body. He was there, lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to machines, surrounded by doctors and nurses who spoke quickly, looking worried. His mother held his hand, crying, while his father stared at him with a look of despair and hope at the same time. But Matthew was not afraid. He knew something much bigger was happening. In the next moment, a force pulled him upwards, and everything around him began to change. The hospital, the machines, the doctors, everything became distant, as if it were being absorbed by an increasingly intense light. It wasn't just any light. It was alive. It was hot. It was as if he had a conscience of his own, as if he knew exactly who he was. Matthew didn't need eyes to see, because he felt this light in every part of his being. And then he saw it. A glowing tunnel opened before him. The light came from inside this tunnel, pulsing gently as if calling to him. But it wasn't an obligation, it was an invitation. And inside that tunnel he saw shadows moving, not dark shadows, but figures, people, beings of light. They were there, waiting for him, but Matthew couldn't see their faces clearly. He felt that they were smiling at him, that they were there to welcome him. He started to move towards them, but he wasn't walking. It was as if he was being carried away, floating effortlessly, as if he were on a river of energy that was taking him to that place. With every second that passed, he felt his mind expanding. It was as if he was remembering something he always knew, but had forgotten. Something inside him said this place was familiar. He's been there before. Suddenly, a feeling of love came over him. A pure, absolute love that enveloped every part of his being. It wasn't like the love he knew on earth. It was bigger. It was stronger. It was like being wrapped in the arms of something infinitely good. It was then that he realized he was not alone. Before him, a figure began to form. It was the strongest, most intense presence I had ever felt. The light around her was unlike any other. It was golden, shiny, powerful. And when that figure stepped forward, Matthew knew without anyone having to say it. It was Jesus. The boy felt his heart race, but not from fear. It was an emotion I couldn't describe. He looked up because Jesus was big, but not in a physical sense. It was as if he was bigger than the space around it. Your face, it was indescribable. So beautiful, so perfect, so full of something Matthew had never seen before. Endless love. Jesus' eyes were piercing but not frightening. It was as if he looked into him, into every part of his being, and knew him completely. There was nothing hidden, nothing hidden. Jesus knew everything about Matthew. Your fears, your dreams, your joys. And even so, his look was one of absolute love. You need to go back. The voice was not just heard, it was felt. It was soft, but at the same time firm. It resonated within him, as if every word was imprinted on his heart. Matthew wanted to ask why. Why go back? Why couldn't I stay there where everything was so beautiful, so perfect? He tried to speak, but before he could, Jesus took another step forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. And then he saw it. Like a bolt of lightning going through his mind, images began to emerge. He saw his family. He saw his mother crying at the bedside. He saw his father's despair. He also saw something else, something beyond. He saw the world. He saw lost people, people suffering, people looking for something they didn't even know what it was. And then the message came. They have forgotten who I am. Matthew felt a shiver run through his being. He knew that sentence meant more than it seemed. It wasn't just about forgetting the name of Jesus. It was about forgetting his essence, his true meaning. People were lost because they no longer recognized him, and Jesus looked at him, and without saying anything else, Matthew understood. He had to go back. The love of Jesus enveloped him once again, and then everything began to disappear. The tunnel of light became more distant. The beings of light disappeared, and suddenly he felt as if he were falling back to earth. And then his eyes opened. The hospital, the machines, the noise of the monitors. He was back. The doctors were in shock. Matthew's parents were speechless. Not only had he woken up, but he was conscious. And then, his voice still weak but firm, he said, "I saw Jesus. He said I needed to go back." The entire room was silent. What had Matthew just experienced? His parents began to cry, but not out of sadness. They knew at that moment that something divine had happened. Doctors tried to find explanations, but nothing made sense. People don't wake up from a coma like that overnight, much less with a report so clear, so deep, so powerful. Matthew looked at his mother and held her hand. He was no longer the same. Something inside him had changed. He was carrying something now, something he knew he would need to share. But what else did he see? What else did Jesus say? If this story has already given you goosebumps so far, just wait until you hear what Matthew revealed later. What Jesus showed him is something that could change everything. Matthew blinked a few times, trying to understand what had just happened. The hospital, the doctors, his family crying. Everything seemed distant. He could still feel the softness of that light around him, like an echo of the presence he had just encountered. But even without seeing more, he knew Jesus was still with him. The vision he saw was neither a dream nor a hallucination. It was real, more real than anything I had ever experienced. The love he felt was not something that could be explained with words. It was as if all the pain in the world, all the fears, all the doubts had disappeared in a single instant. In that place, there was no fear. There was only truth, and the truth was right in front of him. Jesus did not appear as in the images Matthew had already seen. He was not just a figure with a white robe and a long beard, as in the pictures hanging on the walls of churches. He was so much more. His presence was so intense that Matthew almost couldn't look directly at him. The light around him was golden, but it didn't hurt the eyes. It was hot, alive, pulsating, as if every ray of light was made of pure love. He was big, but not in a physical sense. It was as if his presence filled the entire space, as if it was impossible not to feel his strength. And yet, there was no fear. On the contrary, just by looking at him, Matthew knew he was safe. That there, at that moment, there was no more pain, there was no more sadness, there was only love. Jesus extended his hand, and Matthew felt a warmth course through his entire being. It was as if that single connection was capable of restoring everything within him. It wasn't just a hand holding yours. It was as if he was touching her soul. Jesus' eyes were unlike anything Matthew had ever seen. They didn't have a single color. They were like windows to something bigger, something infinite. Within them, Matthew saw the universe itself, and saw more. He saw the past, present, and future intertwining, as if everything was part of a great plan. But most of all, he saw love. A love so pure, so absolute, that it made your heart beat faster. Matthew wanted to talk. He wanted to ask so many things. I wanted to know why I was there. I wanted to know if I would stay in that wonderful place. But before he could say anything, Jesus lightly shook his hand and spoke. Jesus' voice was not just a sound. It was something that echoed within his being. He didn't just listen. He felt it. Each word vibrated within him, as if it were being written in his soul. Every word had weight, meaning. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Matthew felt something inside him expand. It was as if this truth had always been there, but only at that moment did he truly understand what it meant. Jesus continued, "You need to tell the world what you saw." The boy felt a shiver run through his entire being. What did he mean by that? How could a 7-year-old tell something so big? Who would believe him? But Jesus knew his doubts before he could even express them. His gaze was understanding, full of patience. "Don't be afraid." That's when Matthew realized that he really wasn't afraid at all, because there before him, there was only absolute certainty, the certainty that everything would be fine. And then, as if opening an invisible door, Jesus showed him something. It was not a common sight. It wasn't like watching a movie or remembering something from the past. It was deeper. He saw the truth about the world. He saw how lost people were. He saw empty hearts, people searching for something they didn't know how to define. He saw fear, sadness, despair. He saw people looking at the sky without answers, others denying the existence of something greater, and many living without even questioning the meaning of life. And then Matthew understood. Jesus wasn't just there to comfort him, he was giving a mission, and the message was clear. People have forgotten who he really is. That thought hit Matthew like a bolt of lightning. How could anyone forget Jesus? His name was in churches, in prayers, in the Bible, but that's not what Jesus meant. It wasn't about remembering his name, it was about remembering his essence. People talked about him, but they didn't really know him. Many prayed, but they did not feel his presence. Many followed rules, but they did not understand the true meaning of his love. And that was the truth Matthew needed to tell. Jesus didn't want people to just know about him. He wanted them to feel him, to find him within themselves. Let them know that he was never just a figure from the past. He was there, always has been. Matthew began to feel something different inside him, as if he was being pulled back. He looked at Jesus, feeling a pang in his heart. He wanted to stay. I wanted to stay there, in that peace, in that absolute love, but he knew he couldn't. Jesus smiled at him, not an ordinary smile. It was a smile that carried the universe itself within it, a smile that said everything was right, that everything was part of the plan, and then Matthew felt like he was falling, as if the light was moving away. His heart sped up. The tunnel began to close. He tried to hold in that feeling for as long as possible, but in the next instant his eyes opened, the hospital, the doctors, his mother crying at his side, the sound of the monitors. He was back, but Matthew knew nothing would be the same again. Now he carried something inside him, a truth that could not be ignored, and he needed to tell the world. Some truths cannot be ignored. Jesus still speaks to those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. Have you ever felt his presence? Do you believe that he still reveals himself today? Comment "I believe" and share your experience. The first thing Matthew noticed when he opened his eyes was the light, but it was no ordinary light. It did not come from a distant sun, nor from a lamp. It was a living light, a presence that not only illuminated the room, but filled everything around it with a sense of peace impossible to describe. It was not a blinding light, but one that welcomed, and within it, a silhouette began to form. At first, the figure seemed to approach slowly, but Matthew felt like it had been there the whole time. It wasn't someone arriving, he was someone who was always there. Little by little, the shape became clearer, and then he saw it. It was him. Jesus was before him, but not as a simple vision, not as a memory of images I had seen before. He was real as Matthew himself, and when I looked at him, everything around disappeared. There was no more space, there was no more time, there were no more doubts. There was only that presence which was both majestic and familiar. Jesus' eyes were the first thing that caught our attention. They weren't just ordinary eyes. Within them, Matthew saw something infinite. They were deep, intense, as if they contained all the mysteries of the universe and at the same time all the answers. But the most impressive thing was not what he seemed to know. That's what he conveyed. Love. A love so pure, so absolute, that Matthew felt his entire being enveloped by this energy. It was a love without conditions, without judgment, without limits. He had never felt anything like it. It was as if all the love that ever existed in the world was concentrated in that one look. Then Jesus smiled, and in that moment, Matthew knew. He knew he was safe. He knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Jesus didn't need to say anything for him to understand that he was facing something much greater than his own understanding. But then, Jesus reached out his hand. When his fingers touched Matthew's, something extraordinary happened. It was as if a ray of heat ran through his entire being. Not an ordinary heat, but an energy that filled him completely. Every cell in your body, every thought, every part of your spirit was touched by that force. It was as if Jesus was showing him something much deeper than words could express. Then he spoke, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." The words were not just heard. They vibrated inside Matthew. He didn't just listen, he felt each one of them, as if they were being written in your own heart, as if somehow this truth had always been within him, but now it was fully awakened. Jesus then gently shook his hand and continued, "You need to tell the world what you saw." Matthew didn't know exactly what it meant, but he felt like it was a big deal, much bigger than he could understand at that moment. He wanted to ask, wanted to understand more. But before he could say anything, Jesus raised his other hand, and suddenly Matthew saw something that took his breath away. Before him, as if he were looking into an immense mirror that reflected not his image but reality itself, Matthew has seen the world, but not as I knew him. It wasn't just streets, cities, and people. It was something deeper. He saw people from the inside out. I saw their hearts, I saw their fears, I saw their doubts. I saw the emptiness inside many. I saw the silent search for something that not even they knew how to explain. There was suffering, but also hope. There were questions that were never answered. There were souls thirsty for something greater. And then, Matthew realized, people were lost, not because they didn't believe in Jesus, but because they didn't really know him. Many spoke of him, but few felt him. Many were looking for him, but without knowing where to find him. Many had faith, but a faith based on fear, on rules, on empty traditions. They had forgotten the true meaning of his presence. And it was then that Jesus revealed to Matthew something that would change his life forever. "They have forgotten who I am." These words echoed within him like thunder. Jesus was not saying that people had forgotten his name. His name was in books, in churches, in prayers, but his essence of that had been lost. People were far away, not because he had moved away, but because they had built walls between them and the truth. And now, Jesus wanted Matthew to take that message back. The boy felt his heart accelerate. How could he, a boy of just 7 years old, do something so big? How could I convince someone that this was real? Who would believe him? But before he could worry, Jesus looked at him with even greater love. "Don't be afraid." And in that instant, Matthew understood that I wasn't alone. Jesus wasn't just asking him to tell his experience. He was making sure he was with him, always. In every word, in every step, in every doubt. He would never be alone. Then something started to happen. The light around them began to move as if it was being pulled back. Matthew felt a shiver run through his body. He didn't know how, but he felt like he was coming back. He looked at Jesus, wanting to speak, wanting to ask to stay, but Jesus just smiled. And in the next second, Matthew opened his eyes. The hospital, the doctors, devices beeping, his mother crying at his side. He was back, but he knew that nothing would be the same again, because now he carried something inside him, a truth that could not be ignored, something that needed to be told to the world. And he knew, more than anything else, that his mission was just beginning. The air felt heavy when Matthew opened his eyes. The white lights of the hospital were strong, aggressive, completely different from the warm golden light that had enveloped him moments before. For a brief moment he felt a deep emptiness, as if he had been ripped from a place where everything made sense, and thrown back into a world that seemed smaller, less vibrant, less real. He blinked a few times, trying to adjust his vision. The sound of the monitors around him filled the room with a continuous, monotonous rhythm. An insistent beeping marked each beat of his heart, reminding everyone that he was still there, that he was alive. But Matthew felt something was different. He was there, but at the same time, he wasn't the same. His mother was the first to notice. Sitting next to him, holding his small hand between hers, her eyes red from crying, she noticed a slight movement in her son's fingers. Time seemed to stop. Her chest filled with a mixture of shock and hope. For days she had prayed. He had begged God to bring his boy back. Now he was there, awake, breathing, looking at her. The emotion was too strong to contain. She sobbed loudly, pressing her hand to her face as if she feared it was a dream and he might disappear again. Matthew's father, who was sitting in the corner of the room, stood up quickly, his eyes wide, unable to believe what he saw. It was a miracle. Doctors were called immediately. They entered the room hurriedly, already accustomed to scenes of despair, but not expecting what they would see. It was rare, almost impossible, for someone to come back from a deep coma like that, so suddenly. And even rarer was what happened next. Matthew took a deep breath. The air felt heavy, but not because of the machines or the hospital environment. He felt like something big was still hovering around him, something he needed to say. He looked at his mother, with a calm, almost solemn expression, and then, without hesitation, he said the words that would change everything. "I saw Jesus." Silence took over the room. The doctors exchanged looks. Her mother covered her mouth, unable to process what she had just heard. His father froze in place, not knowing how to react. It was a moment that no one expected, but Matthew continued. His voice was soft, but firm. There was no doubt. There was no fear. He didn't speak like someone who dreamed. He spoke like someone who saw, lived, experienced something real. He held my hand. The small hospital room seemed to shrink as Matthew revealed his story. The doctors tried to maintain their composure, but it was impossible not to be impressed by the details he narrated. How could a 7-year-old boy describe something like that? How could someone so small speak about an encounter with Jesus so clearly, so profoundly? Matthew's parents looked at each other. They knew that their son had never studied theology, had never been exposed to reports of near-death experiences. And yet he spoke with the certainty of someone who had stood before the Creator himself. But what impressed them most was Matthew's look. He was no longer the same. His eyes had something different. There was a glow about them, a serenity, a wisdom that didn't seem to belong to a child. It was as if he had seen something that no one else could understand. His mother cried as she listened to her son describe the beauty of the sky, the bright light, the presence of angels, and most of all, the look of Jesus. A look that, according to him, carried all the love in the world. But it also carried a request. He told me I need to tell the world. This phrase echoed in the minds of everyone in the room. What did it mean? Why would Jesus have given this mission to a boy? Matthew didn't have all the answers, but he knew something inside him had changed. In the days that followed, his recovery surprised the medical team. He started talking more, moving faster than anyone expected. His body seemed to respond in a miraculous way. It was as if new strength had been injected into him. But what caught everyone's attention the most? It was his change in behavior. Before the accident, Matthew was a boy like any other, full of energy, but without much interest in spirituality. After he woke up, everything was different. He began to talk about God in a way that no one understood. He described things he had never learned, quoted Bible passages he had never heard before. He knew things that just shouldn't know. And there was more. Things that started to happen around you. The first time was with his grandmother. She had been sick for months with pain that no doctor could explain. One day, while visiting Matthew, he looked her in the eyes and said, "Jesus asked me to lay my hands on you." Matthew's grandmother smiled, not understanding, but something inside her made her accept it. He placed his small hands on his shoulder, and at that moment, something happened. The pain that tormented her disappeared. It simply disappeared. She stood there, scared, touching her own body, unable to believe it. Tests he had days later showed the condition he had carried for years was gone. And that was just the beginning. Matthew started to feel things. He knew when someone was sad. He knew when someone needed help. People who had never seen him before felt something different around him, as if his presence carried something beyond what they could see. He started having dreams. Dreams that seemed more real than reality itself. Dreams where I saw things before they happened. Dreams where I heard the voice of Jesus again. And above all, he was never afraid again. If before he was a child who, like everyone else, was afraid of the dark, afraid of the unknown, afraid of being alone, now none of that existed. He knew he would never be alone again. The boy who woke up from the coma, it was not the same one that had entered it. He came back with a mission. He came back with something that needed to be told. Some people are chosen for something greater, and this story may be proof of that. Do you believe that a child can be sent with a message from Jesus himself? Have you ever heard reports like this? Comment, "I believe," and be part of this conversation. Matthew's story is, without a doubt, extraordinary. But was what he experienced an isolated event? Or is there a larger pattern behind near-death experiences? Something that connects these accounts and points to a much deeper truth about the afterlife, about God, and about what really happens when we leave this world. What is most impressive about Matthew's case is not just the fact that he saw Jesus, but what Jesus said to him. How many people throughout history have gone through something similar and come back with a similar message? How many people who are on the verge of death report the same light, the same peace, and above all, the same encounter with Jesus? NDE reports have a surprising pattern. Many describe a tunnel of light, a feeling of peace so intense that it is impossible to explain in words. Many talk about an indescribable love, as if every part of your being is filled with something greater, something that transcends any human experience. And an impressive number of these people say they saw Jesus. But the most interesting thing is not just the fact that they see Jesus. That's what he tells them. Many report that Jesus does not force them to return, but says it's not time yet, that there is something they need to do, that their mission on earth is not over yet. Many return completely transformed, feeling that they have received a divine mission, exactly like what happened with Matthew. Think about it. Are we ignoring something important about Jesus and the afterlife? Because what these people describe is not just a date, it's a calling. And not a call just for them, but for all of us. Matthew wasn't the first to come back from the other side with such a strong message, and it certainly won't be the last. Cases like his happen all the time in all parts of the world. One of the best-known stories is that of Colton Burpo, a boy who, at the age of 4, fell into a coma during surgery and came back with an impressive story. He described going to heaven, seeing Jesus, and even recognizing a brother his mother had lost to a miscarriage, something he never knew before his coma. He told details about his family, about heaven, about Jesus, that he simply could not know. Another famous case is that of Dr. Just Alexander, a renowned neurosurgeon who was completely skeptical of the afterlife until he himself had an NDE. He fell into a deep coma due to severe meningitis, and during this period, he reports being taken to a place of light and peace, where he saw spiritual beings and experienced infinite love. When he returned, his outlook on existence completely changed. He went from being skeptical to believing that consciousness continues beyond death. And it doesn't stop there. Thousands of reports around the world follow the same pattern. People of different cultures, ages, and beliefs describe the same type of experience, the same feeling of fulfillment, the same encounter with Jesus or with beings of light. What does this mean? Could this all just be coincidence? Are these stories just a figment of imagination, or is there a greater truth that humanity has not yet fully understood? If we stop to think, the Bible itself is full of passages that talk about life after death, encounters with God and spiritual visions. The Apostle Paul, for example, talks about being caught up to the third heaven and seeing things he could not even describe. The entire book of Revelation is based on a spiritual vision, where John describes heaven, the throne of God, the angels, and the events that are yet to come. So, if the biblical accounts talk about experiences similar to those of Matthew and so many other people, why is there still so much doubt about what happens after death? The answer may lie in the very warning Jesus gave Matthew. They have forgotten who I am. Perhaps this is the key to understanding all of this. Perhaps humanity has strayed so far from the truth that it now needs signs like this to remind us. Because if there's one thing all these stories have in common, it's the transformation that happens in people after they return. They are never the same again, and not just because they experienced death, but because they returned with an absolute certainty that life does not end here. They return with a new vision about what really matters. They stop being afraid of death. They start to value people more. They begin to feel the presence of God in a different way, and many, like Matthew, return with a purpose, a mission to share what they saw, to tell the world that there is something bigger, something that goes beyond this physical reality. This is something that needs to be taken seriously, because if these people are right, then the life we live here could be just the beginning of something much bigger. And more than that, maybe what we do here really matters for what comes next. So are we living the way we should? Are we ignoring the signs? Are we so caught up in the concerns of earthly life that we forget to look at the spiritual? Because if these stories are real, and everything indicates that they are, then the biggest question we can ask ourselves is, are we ready for what comes next? Stories like Matthew's make us question everything we believe about life, death, and what really happens after we leave this world. No matter what your belief, there is something impossible to ignore when we hear reports like this. The striking pattern between near-death experiences, the constant presence of light, unconditional love, and the profound transformation of those who return. People who, before being skeptical, become absolutely certain that something exists beyond this life. People who, after dying for a few minutes, return completely different, as if they had received an answer to humanity's biggest question. What happens after death? What if this isn't all just a coincidence? What if each of these accounts is, in fact, a fragment of a much larger puzzle? A sign, a call, a warning that there is something we do not yet fully understand. Perhaps the greatest truth of existence has always been before us, but over the years, with the rush of the world, with the distractions of life, we simply stop paying attention. We forget the essentials, we forget the spiritual. How many times do we ignore small signs that may have come from beyond? How many times have we felt something different, an inexplicable presence, an unexpected chill, a dream so real it seemed more than just a dream? How many times do we sense something that then actually happened? How many times do we feel that someone who has already left is still somehow close by, protecting us, guiding us? If all this were just imagination, why do so many people in different parts of the world, with different beliefs and cultures, report the same sensations? Matthew's case is not unique. Thousands of people have come back from the dead with similar stories. Many of them report encounters with beings of light, feel a peace they have never experienced before, say they have seen relatives who had already left, and some, perhaps the most impressive, they return with specific messages, warnings, revelations that seem designed to make us wake up. And the most intriguing thing is that all these messages seem to point in the same direction: the need to see life beyond what the eyes can see, beyond the material, beyond what is fleeting. Jesus himself, in the message he gave to Matthew, said something that resonates powerfully: "They have forgotten who I am." What did he mean by that? Has humanity really strayed from the truth? Are we so immersed in our routines, worries, and desires that we stop feeling his presence? Think about it. When was the last time you stopped to reflect on your life beyond the here and now? When was the last time you felt something different, something that made you wonder if there was something bigger? And more than that, what would happen if today was your last day here? This is a question that may seem uncomfortable, but it is the only certainty we all have. One day, we will all have to face this moment. What if there was a greater purpose for all of this? What if the life we lead now was just a preparation for something much greater? What these near-death experiences seem to show us is that death is not the end, that consciousness continues, that there is a plan, that nothing happens by chance. And if there's anything we can learn from all these stories, it's that we need to start seeing beyond the obvious. We need to be more attentive. We need to remember that we are here for a reason, that our life has a purpose, that each of us carries within us a spark of the divine. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson we can take from all of this. Don't wait for a near-death experience to realize that there is something much bigger than this reality. The question that remains is, what are you going to do with this information? Nothing happens by chance. God may be speaking to you right now, guiding you to this message at the right time. Hearing this today could change everything. This could be the sign you needed. This message reached you for a reason. There are truths that science cannot explain, and reports that bring us closer to what really matters. Life doesn't end here. God still speaks to us, and you are part of it. Sign up now and leave your light to continue this journey of discovery. Nothing is by chance, and getting here can be a sign. Did something inside you connect with this message? Comment, "I heard the voice of God," and be part of those who felt this presence. I want to know who received this call. Something tells me this journey isn't over yet. The next video is already on your screen, and what you see could change everything. Click now and find out. Maybe the answer you're looking for is closer than you think.